Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 281, Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira is almost here. It goes down November 12th at Madison Square Garden, and this is one of the most anticipated fight cards of the year, and I'm going to go through the entire main card, briefly discuss every fight on the main card, and then at the end of the video, I am going to grade UFC 281 on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the greatest fight card of all time. And also, I'm going to answer the question, is UFC 281 worth your money? So before I get into any of that, I've already made 2 videos on UFC 281, top 3 things I love about UFC 281 and top 3 things I hate about UFC 281. I will link both those videos down in the description if you want to check them out after this. But also down in the description, I have the entire main card for UFC 281. I want you to briefly look at that, and then I want you to comment down below what grade would you give UFC 281 on a scale from 1 to 10 before you even hear my opinion. I'm curious what you think. So first off, starting off with the main event, we have Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira for the middleweight title. And this is one of the most anticipated middleweight title fights, I believe, since Israel Adesanya has become champion. He's kind of got a rap now for having boring fights. He's had a couple boring fights in a row, and now people are kind of writing off Adesanya and saying, I don't want to really watch him. This is an amazing matchup, and this has an amazing backstory. Alex Pereira KO'd Israel Adesanya in kickboxing, and he also has a decision win over Israel Adesanya in kickboxing as well. And now he's followed him over to MMA. He's reeled off a couple wins. He's been fast-tracked to the middleweight title, and now we are going to see, can Alex Pereira do it again? But this time in MMA, can he dethrone Israel Adesanya? That's an amazing backstory. You couldn't write a better story than that. And on top of that, these are 2 elite-level strikers. I'm really looking forward to see them both inside the cage, trying to get reads on each other, because in a fight like this, if you make one mistake, next thing you know, you were KO'd. And Alex Pereira has that left hook that is just an absolute nuclear punch, and he can put anyone out cold. Look what he did to Sean Strickland, and he's done it to Israel Adesanya before. And what I think makes this fight so great on top of all that is the perceived threat to Israel Adesanya. Regardless of what you think of the fights, regardless of what you think of Israel Adesanya, his last few fights, the perceived threat of him losing his title has not been there. And that's what makes a fight so compelling and so exciting. You look back at UFC 276, Israel Adesanya versus Jared Cannonier. There was barely anyone that thought Jared Cannonier had a legitimate shot to dethrone Israel Adesanya. And, the excitement for the main event really wasn't there. You look at the fight before that. You had Israel Adesanya versus Robert Whittaker 2. While that ended up being a close fight, going into that fight, the perceived threat to Israel Adesanya's title really wasn't there, especially because people were looking back at the first fight against Robert Whittaker, and it just wasn't there. And in this fight against Alex Pereira, we know that Pereira was able to do it twice before. And I know that was in kickboxing. That's a totally different sport. And I know that was years ago. But the perceived threat is there. This is the first time in a long, long time going into an Israel Adesanya fight, people can imagine him losing. And with the boring performances that he's had, there's a lot of people that want to see him lose. And if there's a style that's going to beat him, it's going to be another elite level kickboxer. Because can Pereira go out there and KO him? Yes. But maybe, just maybe, Pereira can play that game where he kicks box at range and maybe he wins a close decision. So this is a very compelling fight. And you just add the layer that this is for the middleweight title. This is, the top fight in the middleweight division. This proves who is the best 185er on the planet. And you add all those things together, that makes this fight super compelling. On paper, it could, it looks great. But in reality, it could turn out not to be a super exciting fight. But I believe regardless, if this ends up being a super exciting fight, it will be fun to watch. Because at any moment, one of these guys can make a mistake and the other can capitalize and put one of them out. I know Adesanya is not known for finishing fights as of lately, but we cannot forget what he did to Paulo Costa. We cannot forget what he did to Robert Whittaker to win the title. We cannot forget that crazy fight with Kelvin Gastelum where he almost finished Kelvin Gastelum in the 5th round, and Kelvin Gastelum is super durable. So not only can Alex Pereira potentially KO Israel Adesanya, and what a crazy sight that would be, because Israel Adesanya has never lost in the UFC in the middleweight division. His only loss in the UFC is when he's gone up and fought Jan Blachowicz at light heavyweight. He tried to become double champion, and he got out wrestled for the majority of the fight, and he lost that way. But he's never lost in the middleweight division. Can Alex Pereira get it done? Can he do it for a 3rd time, even though this isn't a different sport? The first 2 were in kickboxing. That is a super compelling story, and the perceived threat is just there for Alex Pereira. Can he KO Israel Adesanya? I believe going into this fight, a lot of people believe that he will, and that's what makes this fight so compelling. Moving on to the co-main event, we have Carla Esparza defending her strawweight title against Weili Zhang. And while I'm not particularly hyped for this matchup as a whole, because what gets me most excited is high-level competitive matchups where you look at the fight and you're like, I really don't know what's going to happen, you know? The reason we were so excited for UFC 280, Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev, is the style clash and who's going to win. I know it ended up not being that competitive, but on paper, a lot of people perceived it as super competitive. And for this fight, Carla Esparza versus Weili Zhang, I don't look at this fight as super competitive. I really believe that Weili Zhang, her striking, her power, her speed, is just leaps and bounds ahead of Carla Esparza. And if Weili Zhang goes out there and does what Weili Zhang does, I really think that Weili Zhang will go out there and absolutely brutalize Carla Esparza. And am I excited to see that? Yes, I'm excited to see that. After what Carla Esparza did in her last fight against Rose Namajunas to win the belt, I don't think she deserved that belt. I don't think Rose Namajunas deserved that belt. I said after that fight at UFC 274, I never wanted to see Carla Esparza or Rose Namajunas fight again. It was an absolute abomination. It was a terrible fight. But I'm kind of excited to watch Weili Zhang go out there and take the belt from her. But at the same time, it's not as good. You know, you look back, and initially the first fight between Weili Zhang and Rose Namajunas, when Zhang was defending her title against Namajunas, that was one of my most anticipated women's fights of all time, because I was like, I have no idea what's going to happen here. Both girls are super high level, and I'm really excited for this matchup. But in this fight, I feel like I already know what happens. So that kind of diminishes my hype for the fight, even though the outcome that I foresee is an outcome that I want. I would much rather have a super competitive fight on paper and be like, okay, I have no idea what's going to happen, and try to predict it and anticipate it, rather than just think, okay, well, Weili Zhang probably goes out there and brutalizes her. It just kind of diminishes it a little bit, and that's what makes this co-main event not as fun as it could be. You look back at Weili Zhang versus Rose Namajunas. They had 2 fights. I know the first one ended up not being competitive. You had the head kick KO from Rose Namajunas. People were excited for that fight. The rematch, people were excited for that fight because we saw the fight could go either way. I truly believe most people believe that Weili Zhang will go out there and defeat Carla Esparza. So I'm not particularly excited for it, even though I know that I will be super excited to see Carla Esparza lose that belt. Moving down the fight card to the featured fight on the main card, we have Dustin Poirier versus Michael Chandler. And what an absolute amazing matchup this is. Dustin Poirier, the fights with Justin Gaethje, the fight with Eddie Alvarez, the 2 fights recently against Conor McGregor. Dustin Poirier is never in a boring fight. He is never in a boring fight. You look at Michael Chandler. I know he's relatively new to the UFC. Look what he did to Tony Ferguson. That brutal front kick KO of Tony Ferguson. Absolute insanity. His UFC debut against Dan Hooker put him out in the first round. You look at the vacant title fight against Charles Oliveira, absolutely amazing. You look at the fight at UFC 268 against Justin Gaethje, absolutely amazing. You go back to Bellator. I know a lot of people didn't follow Michael Chandler in Bellator. I watched the majority of Michael Chandler's career in Bellator. Some of the most exciting fights I've ever seen were Michael Chandler versus Eddie Alvarez. Both of these guys are known for being in exciting fights. They're never in boring fights. I mean, I cannot wait for this matchup. And we never know how a fight's going to play out on paper. When it gets to the fight night, we have no idea what's actually going to happen. I have no doubt that Dustin Poirier versus Michael Chandler will be an exciting fight. I think it's an interesting style matchup because you have Dustin Poirier, who has great boxing, great stamina, great durability, a lot of experience. You have Michael Chandler, the speed, the explosiveness, the power, the wrestling, the anti-jiu-jitsu, the submission defense. Michael Chandler is, one of the most exciting fighters ever, but he's also one of the most well-rounded fighters ever. And you can say the exact same thing for Dustin Poirier, one of the most well-rounded fighters in MMA. And now we get to see them against each other. And if I had one complaint, I really wish this fight was 5 rounds. I'm very disappointed that this fight is not 5 rounds. Especially, I don't necessarily think the winner of this fight is going to be fighting for a title anytime soon. But you never know. The division just got shook upside down. Both of these guys had losses to Charles Oliveira, the lightweight champion. Well, guess what? Oliveira is no longer the champion. Islam Makhachev is your new lightweight champion. So both these guys are very close, You never know. They get another 2 wins after this or even 1 win. There's a legitimate chance they could be fighting for a title. And I just wish this fight was 5 rounds because if it ends up being one of the greatest fights of all time and we could have had a 4th and 5th round, I'm going to be very disappointed. And every time I've complained about having a fight that doesn't have 5 rounds, Khamzat Chimaev versus Gilbert Burns, Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley, and looking back, man, what I would give to have 5 rounds for both those fights. But nonetheless, I think this is going to be a classic MMA fight, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think this is a fight we will most likely remember for years to come. I have no belief that this fight will be boring whatsoever, and I'm really looking forward to this lightweight matchup. Moving down the card, and this is where the card kind of starts to get iffy. You have Frankie Edgar versus Chris Gutierrez. This is Frankie Edgar, the former lightweight champion. He is now fighting at bantamweight. He's lost like 5 out of his last 6, and the one fight that he did win was a split decision that he probably should have lost against an up-and-coming guy like Chris Gutierrez. I defended this fight being on the main card because this is supposedly Frankie Edgar's retirement fight, and he is a legend of the sport, and he's fighting close to home. He's from New Jersey. They're fighting in New York. I do believe that a legend like this does belong on the main card of UFC 281. But as far as the matchup, I'm not chomping at the bit to see Frankie Edgar versus Chris Gutierrez. I think it's a competitive fight. I think Frankie Edgar, this is a winnable fight for him, and they're not giving him, the bantamweight division is full of absolute savages, and I don't think, Chris Gutierrez is a lock to lose this fight against Frankie Edgar, but I think it's a very winnable matchup for Frankie Edgar. I think he can get it done, but again, what does it really mean? Chris Gutierrez is just trying to make a name off a legend. Frankie Edgar's just trying to ride off into the sunset on a win. Do I think it's a decent stylistic matchup? Yeah. I think it'll be exciting. I think it'll be primarily striking. I think Frankie could mix in the grappling. We'll have to see. But I'm not dying to see this matchup in the bantamweight division. But I am happy it's on the main card. And I am happy that they gave a legend like Frankie Edgar at least a semi-winnable fight in his supposed retirement fight. Moving down the card, what opens up the main card of UFC 281, we have Dan Hooker versus Claudio Puelles. Stylistically, this is your typical striker versus grappler. Claudio Puelles wants to get you down. He wants to look for submissions. He wants to control you from the top. Dan Hooker wants to strike. Dan Hooker's now in a situation where he's lost a couple fights in a row. He went down to featherweight. He got absolutely wrecked by Arnold Allen. And, the fight before that, I believe, was the one short notice against Islam Makhachev where he got submitted in the first round. So he's coming off back-to-back first-round losses. And now the UFC is giving him a winnable fight in Claudio Puelles. I never expected this matchup. But Claudio Puelles is a legit fighter, and I believe he can actually win this fight. So this is a massive fight for both guys because if Dan Hooker loses this fight, I think the story of Dan Hooker's career is going to be Dustin Poirier took his soul in the middle of 2020. He had that crazy back and forth fight with Dustin Poirier, and now basically he's never been the same again. I know he had the win over Nasrat Haqparast, but what does that really mean at all? This is a winnable fight to get Dan Hooker back in track, and maybe he fights a top 15 opponent after this. But this is one of those fights where if you lose, Dan Hooker is done for. And for Claudio Puelles, this is the biggest name he's ever fought. So he wants to go out there and beat a guy like Dan Hooker and have, a veteran like Dan Hooker on his resume. So this is a very important fight for both guys. Stylistically, it's going to be very interesting. Can Puelles take him down and submit him? Can Dan Hooker keep it standing and light Claudio Puelles up on the feet? So I think it's an interesting stylistic matchup. I think it makes perfect sense opening up the main card. But am I like crazy excited for this fight? No, not particularly. I think there's some prelims, which we're not necessarily going to talk about in depth because we're talking about the main card here, that could have opened up the main card and replaced either of the last two fights I talked about. Renato Moicano versus Brad Riddell or Dominic Reyes versus Ryan Spann, I believe are both better than Dan Hooker, Claudio Puelles, or Frankie Edgar, Chris Gutierrez. But this is the main card of UFC 281. So, I'm looking forward to all these fights. None of these fights just scream at me and say, ugh, I hate this fight. We talked about UFC 279 ad nauseum. It was one of the worst fight cards ever. But this main card of UFC 281 is pretty solid. I think, with some tweaks, it could be better, but it is what it is. I'm grading it based on how it currently exists. And as far as my grade for UFC 281, you look at Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. I'm very, very excited for that matchup. Amazing backstory. Two elite fighters fighting for the middleweight title. Doesn't get any better than that, regardless of how the fight actually turns out. Carla, Esparza, Weili, Zhang. It's a title fight, but is it going to be competitive? I don't think so. Dustin, Poirier, Michael Chandler. Absolutely amazing fight. Love that fight. Frankie Edgar, Chris Gutierrez. It doesn't really mean a whole lot outside of a legend like Frankie Edgar trying to, just ride off on a win. Dan Hooker versus Claudio Puelles. We just talked about that, so we won't get into it anymore. How do I grade this fight card? I am giving UFC 281 a 7.5 out of 10. I think this is a quality fight card, but I just think you can really pick it apart. The co-main event, not going to be super competitive. The feature fight on the main card, there's really nothing bad you can say about that outside of, not being 5 rounds. But those two first fights, they leave a lot to be desired. It's not particularly stacked. And I think the main event is a very good main event. You can't really get a better main event than Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. So I think that's what kind of carries this card. But I do think this is a quality card. I do think it's relatively stacked. And, I'm grading the pay-per-view here, and I do think that UFC 281 is worth your money, especially when you look at what you're getting on the prelims, but that's not really what you're paying for. The prelims are free. So 7.5 out of 10. Let me know what you guys think about that down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.